Hi, welcome to Napa Valley Wine Academy. Today, we're going to talk about one of the most amazing estates in South Africa, which is Klein Constantia. And we're going to discuss it because we just received the book from Academie du Vin on this absolutely amazing estate. And we want to share its predominant history and what they do today and how that history changed over time and what are the new developments in Klein Constantia. And because of that, along with the Academie du Vin, invited to the conversation Matthew Day, a winemaker at Klein Constantia and also the Anne Wilka, who grew up in Johannesburg, but at the same time traveled a lot after his graduation at the Stellenbosch University with Bachelor of Science and viticulture and enology. And he traveled through the Barossa. He worked in Barossa, Saint-Emilion, and Napa Valley to gain the knowledge, to bring it back to the Klein Constantia, and to make a mark in history. So, welcome, Matthew Day.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you for having me, everyone. It's not often that I'm a character in a book, so what a privilege. If you open
Well,
up to the second half of the book, you see a couple of pictures of me, which is fantastic, and I'm glad to be a custodian of this fantastic brand called Klein Constantia. And then Constance is obviously very important to us, but the South African wine industry, I guess, at the end of the day, is a lot more important, and how to take it further into the international world is fantastic.
so let's talk about that. Let's talk about you coming on in actually 2008, but taking on the role of the winemaker in 2012. But let's go back in time, so our students and those who are watching us today will know what is the significance of Klein Constantia, because it is not the recent changes that are really making Constantia, but the long history and its presence throughout Europe centuries ago. So, can you share some insights to the origins and the historical significance of the estate and
Sure.
Constantia together?
Of course, and luckily we have lots of time today because I can lecture you about history for hours. I'm not going to do that, but I'll try and summarize it as best as I can. So quite often that we kind of forget that South Africa, Constantia, Cape Town, next to Table Mountain, was the very first New World wine producing region, and that was all founded in 1685. So we go back to when Jan van Riebeeck colonized the Cape and everything happened. He planted vineyards, but he never really made it famous in those days. So that was quite experimental. In 1685, it was actually the governor of the Cape, Simon van der Stel, who started the vineyards of Constantia. And I'm kind of emphasizing the dates of 1685 as in 1685 is way before anything that we know in the old world. And I've recently done a seminar on Sancerre, and you look at, we think that Sancerre and France and all the rest have been around for many years. They have definitely been making wine for a long time. But you look at Sancerre, they only started producing Sauvignon Blanc in 1936. So if we look at 1685, there's very little happening in the rest of the world. It's way before Napa Valley. It's said that the vines that actually made it to Margaret River in Perth, or just below Perth, were cuttings that came from Constantia in those days. So the Constantia Valley itself was the pioneer of vines being planted in the southern hemisphere. Don't get me wrong, there was wine made in the southern hemisphere in those days, but the wine that was made in those days were for church. It was made for communion as opposed to being for drinking and enjoying as the way that we do today. So I can talk for hours about it, but if I can put it into perspective, so Constantia Valley, founded in 1685, Simon van der Stel, he was granted any land that he pleased in those days, being the governor. So he sent out his workers, and they went and they surveyed the soil and the land throughout the whole of the Cape. They went as far as sending soil samples back to Europe and having those soil samples analyzed. It was absolutely crazy when you think about it in those days. What were they actually analyzing for, and what did they actually understand? The Dutch, being the Dutch, they actually understood farming very well. I don't know what they were testing, but if you come to Klein Constantia today, you kind of realize why he planted his flag here in Constantia, and it's purely because of the beauty of what we have. So we're on the foothills of Table Mountain. We're on the peninsula heading out to Cape Point, which is beautiful. We've got Cape Town right next to us. We're a suburb of Cape Town. And the other great thing that we had for moving on for us in those days is the harbor itself. Because of, if you look at the bay itself, we're in the sheltered bay of the Cape of Good Hope, so it was False Bay, and the harbor that they would have docked the ships in was called Simonstown, which is about 15 kilometers from Constantia. There we go, great picture. So if you see the bottom corner to the right, that's Cape Point, and you can see on that map, you can see where Simonstown was. The significant point of that is the ships would have docked at Simonstown, and we had all the trade heading through Simonstown, and you can see where the Constantia Valley is there, pretty much in the middle of the picture, going through to the fort or the castle of Cape Town in those days. So we had all the wagons and all the trade coming through the farmlands of Constantia. Simon van der Stel, it was more of an experimental and kind of farm that was producing everything and anything. And he planted the vineyards on the slopes, and he would have done a whole lot of vegetables and fruits and all the rest in the rest of the farm. So as we had it, the sailors would have picked up their produce from that, and they picked up their wine. And I think scurvy was a big thing in those days. They used to enjoy drinking wine to kind of combat that. So that was the start of the Constantia Valley. It wasn't Simon van der Stel that made it famous. Simon van der Stel then went on to find a little wine region that I'm not sure if anyone knows about. It's called Stellenbosch. It's a random little place in I'm joking. It's a fantastic red wine producing region in South Africa, and it's pretty much everyone knows about South African wine region is Stellenbosch. So Van der Stel went on to found Stellenbosch. So he was the pioneer of Stellenbosch and Constantia itself. But it wasn't him that we have to thank for the reason that we're still here today. It was a guy called Hendrik Klute and another guy called Johannes Colijn. Between the two of them, and there's Hendrik Klute over there, you can see the kind of colonial way that he looked there. So Hendrik Klute was together with Johannes Colijn in those days. They created the sweet wine of Constantia. And the sweet wine of Constantia was a wine that only became very famous because of its ability to last, and its ability to last the voyage back to Europe, the voyage back to the United States, wherever it was going. And the only reason for that success is purely because in those days, they didn't have the same understanding of science and technology as we have today. They didn't have the understanding of preservatives as we have today. So normal white wine, normal red wine wouldn't have lasted as long as we would have wines lasting today. The trick with the sweet wine is it's got sugar, and sugar formed that preservative that meant that you can put it onto the ship 3-4 months in the heat, whatever it was. It could be in a barrel or in a bottle, whatever it is, and it would make it all the way back to Europe. And now you can picture a wine from deepest, darkest Africa that we had kings and aristocracy and all these fancy, amazing people that used to drink the sweet wine of Constantia. And they went out and they bragged about it because they had a wine from deepest, darkest Africa. And that's hence why we have this fantastic track record. And if you look at the book, Joanne Gibson highlights a lot of the people that used to drink the wine. And quite often we've spoken about Napoleon. So Napoleon himself used to get an allocation of the sweet wine of Constantia while he was on exile in St. Helena. Jane Austen wrote about it in Sense and Sensibility. Charles Dickens wrote about it. And there's a lot of very famous people in those days that sought after the sweet wine of Constantia. And it probably was one of the greatest sought after wines in the world. It was very scarce, it was very hard to come by. It would have been one of the most expensive wines that money could buy. So that's kind of how it started. I won't get
But
into Johannes.
second, talk about the that was the reason how it started. But there's a specific reason that about the climatic conditions as well. There's that acidity that balances the sweetness as well, that allows for aging. So can you bring in, the location, the climatic conditions that actually allow to make the wines of this magnitude of significance?
For sure. So the wines in those days were made from four different cultivars. The red being Pontac, which was a very last varietal. It's one of the only grape varietals or cultivars that has red juice as well as red flesh. Most red grapes have got white juice and white flesh. So Pontac was very important. They used it to make port style wines in those days, or to blend into the sweet wine Constantia. Then we had Semillon, Chenin Blanc, and Muscat de Frontignan. And we had two variations of the Muscat Le Petit Grand. It was red and white Muscat. So, in order for the success of the making of the sweet wine in those days, they heavily relied on raisins, and that's pretty much what we do today. And we've done a lot of research into the way that the wines were made in the old days, and we've tried to recreate the Vin de Constance in that style. So it wasn't made from botrytis. It's not a noble eight harvest. It's a it's a wine made from raisins. It's naturally dried on the vines. It's not a straw wine. It kind of all happens because of the perfect climate that we have. So just to go into climate, we're right between the ocean on both sides. It's the cold Atlantic Ocean, which keeps us nice and cool during the summer. It means we have a very long kind of harvest period. So the Vin de Constance today we can pick for 3 months, 27 different batches, which is crazy. So long period. It is dry during harvest, but we're also able to, because of the nature of the muscat, we're able to raisin out the muscat into a point that you can pick individual perfect raisins to make that sweet wine. Um, with the cooler climate, you also get the great pH, which means that the acidity is coming out from very early raisining of the berries. So at that point, you're raisining sugar and acidity together to give you that perfect balance. You can see a picture of the bush vines on the picture to your bottom left. Those are also very important to the style of muscat that we're making today. That's actually Sauvignon Blanc, but
But you also have two different type of trellising, right? So you use the bush vine and you use the trellised vines. What are the differences when it comes to the style? Why do you do that?
so trellis vines are more of modern age. I mean, it's what we're used to in modern winemaking in South Africa, or I guess the rest of the world. Bush vines themselves would have been the way that they planted the vines in the old days. And what we're looking for is the combination between the two. So bush vines themselves, because of the shape of the vine, you can kind of picture it like this. You get a lot more sunlight penetration into the bunch zone is exactly what we're looking for to harness that raisining kind of characteristic. So if you look at the shape, you're getting sunlight into this zone over here. You're getting a reflection of the soil as the soil because it's so close to the ground, and hence your raisining happens very early in the season. And it's kind of, I like to equate it to a straw wine, as in you take a straw wine, you harvest it, you put it out into the straw, to the mat, and you're concentrating very high acid levels and very high sugar levels because it's picked quite early in the season. Bush vines do exactly the same, as they accelerate that raisining process because of the concentration of sunlight that they're getting and solar radiation. So they're raising very early in the season. Whereas trellis vines are more traditional, so they take a very long time to slowly ripen out into a point that they form raisins. So we try and we're currently 70% trellis vines, 30% bush vines. We try and get the combination right between the two to get that very nice balance of natural acidity, lovely complexity from the trellis vines, with all the sugar that we need to make a great sweet
Perfect. Thank you. So, but
wine.
let's move on. We'll move a little bit through the history, but let's move through the modern history to who owned the estate early in early 1900s, because we will be tasting one of those wines influenced or named after Clara. And then let's move on to today's history and discuss who is the owner now and what happened in 2011, because that's we will be tasting Van de Constance from 11 today, which actually marks a end of one era in history and start of another.
Brilliant. So a couple things happened since Johannes Colleen and Hendrik Kluter's time. So there was basically the demise of the wine industry in South Africa, and that happened in a period between 1885 and 1913. And the crazy thing is, I've tasted two bottles of the sweet wine of Constantia from 1875, and they are both absolutely perfect. We had them next to the current day Van der Constance, and they have a very similar characteristic. They've still got that muscat, they still have the acidity and the freshness. You can taste that it's not it's not, they haven't added alcohol or anything to it. Anyway, so I've tasted those, and I've had an 1821 and I've had an 1791 of the sweet wine of Constantia. I think I'm just bragging a little bit because I've had some fantastic old vintages of sweet wine of Constantia.
We love to hear it because it's always interesting, the development, how wine changes over time. And, that ties up with the history. There's a reason why those wines were so famous back in the day and are still famous today.
Yeah, well, they lasted beautifully, and what I was trying to get to him is in 1885 was pretty much the demise of the wine industry in the Cape, and when everyone talks about the demise of the wine industry, we always talk about phylloxera and the new rootstocks that eventually came out and saved the world, and without the Avitis Americanus, we wouldn't have wine today unless it was made in Australia or South America or whatever it was. So we talk about phylloxera. It wasn't phylloxera that destroyed the Cape industry. The initial problem that we had was oidium, so mildew that took over, and that was in about 1885. Then we had the issue is we abolished slavery, and of course we should have done it, and everything happened because of that. So we abolished slavery. The problem we didn't have cheap and easy labor, so the wines became very expensive to make. So that was the first fault, and then we went into the next issue is the English stopped trading with their colonies, and they started the free trade agreement with the French, and they started trading wines with the French as opposed to getting wines from the colonies. So then we had expensive wines, and we didn't have a market for the wines, and it became very difficult to sell it. So that was the demise, and then phylloxera hit, and it pretty much wrote off the whole of the South African wine industry. Klein Constantia continued as it is, but it became more of a hobby farm. So it became a farm that, they had some vineyards, but it was more, and this is where we get Clara Hussey coming in. Clara Hussey had a lot of money. She was an American steelless, and she had, I suppose she was a millionaire in those days. But it was a great, fantastic farm where they had huge parties, and they had, you can see some of the pictures at the pool, I think, at the next slide. The building is still exactly the same as what it was. I mean, we often have parties at that pool in the bottom left-hand side. We recreated, but it was a great place, and this is one of the great places to come to in the Cape to kind of have a good time. So Clara Hussey did that. We carried on going, and the farm was never profitable. We sold a lot of the grapes to Stellenbosch Farmers Union, it's now called Distel, and eventually it got to a point that it went to the Austin family, and the Austin family kept it going in the same thing. The problem was they weren't making money off it, and a guy called Dougie Jooste got involved. Dougie Jooste used to own Cedric's and Old Buck Gin and a whole lot of the different wine companies in Stellenbosch or in the Cape. He used to do a lot of business with Stellenbosch Farmers Union, and he met Dougie Austin on a flight to Joburg. And Dougie was talking about this farm that was kind of derelict, and he didn't know what to do, and he had to move to Johannesburg because his wife was living in Johannesburg. And in the plane, they kind of decided that, he kind of said to Dougie, he said, "Make me an offer." And Dougie said, I'll give you one of these. And that meant 1 million rand. 1 million rand today is literally, you can't buy 2 by 2 meters in Constantia for 1 million rand anymore. So he bought Klein Constantia for 1 million rand in those days. Dougie had sold all his wine businesses. He bought Klein Constantia for 1 million rand, and he rebuilt it to what we know as Klein Constantia is today. So he built the cellar, he renovated the manor house, he planted all the vineyards. He was instrumental in hiring the right people to take over the vineyards and the winemaking. He was one of the first guys in the Cape to plant Sauvignon Blanc. And obviously Sauvignon Blanc is a very a very soft spot for me because I absolutely love Sauvignon Blanc. It's a fantastic varietal and it's perfect for our terroir, and they did a great job with that. And they recreated the sweet wine of Constantia, and they created the Vin de Constance as we know today. So we have him to thank for that. If we go into current generation, so Dougie started its first vintages in 1986. He then passed it on to his children, and there were a couple of issues, and I won't mention what happened, but eventually it got to a point that they put the farm onto the market, and Lowell Euster, who I used to work for as assistant winemaker, and I was fortunate enough to spend quite a bit of time with Dougie as well. He's the most inspiring, amazing person that I've ever met. So Lowell Euster, his son, was running the farm, and Lowell put the farm onto the market, and he wasn't willing to sell it to everyone kind of thing. So he was very, very serious about who he sold it to. And we had some massive offers from some incredible wine companies in the world, and he turned them down because they didn't have the vision that Lowell was looking for to take Klein Constantia to. So he eventually found a guy called Staniak Bacalo, who's a self-made Czech-American billionaire. He doesn't own anything to do with the wine industry. Klein Constantia is super passionate for him. It's a way of having fun and just expressing his way of life. So we form part of his hobby division. He kind of bankrolls everything that we do at Klein Constantia, which is fantastic to us. So he's got a couple of hobby division businesses that he has. So he's got a Tour de France cycling team. He has a computer gaming software company, and he's got Klein Constantia. So we have fun for him. And I'm paid to live the life of a billionaire, and I do my thing, and I make wine, and I live someone else's dream, which is fantastic. The other owner is Charles Harmon. So Charles Harmon is an investment banker. He used to be head of JP Morgan in Africa. Fantastic guy. He makes sure that we make a profit. And then getting into my story as a young winemaker at Klein Constantia. So
You started before that happened, right? You started in 2008 as an assistant winemaker before
that's
the final sale.
Yeah, so I was very fortunate that I graduated at Stellenbosch, and during my time at Stellenbosch, I had to do an internship. And my internship, for some reason, I landed up at Meerlist Wine Estate in Stellenbosch. So in my time there, I decided I was quite bored. I bought some grapes. I bought half a ton of grapes, and I bought a barrel from Chris Williams, and I made a barrel of wine because I thought in my university year I could drink wine with all my mates, and university needs some wine, and all the rest would be good fun. I only bottled it a year later after having worked in Barossa. And this is the interesting part is I bottled the wine the week before, and I walked into a job interview at Klein Constantia with Adam Mason, my predecessor. And I had a magnum of Shiraz that I just bottled in my boot of the car. And I thought, let me be gutsy. And I walked into this interview to be an intern. And I walked in and I slapped the bottle of wine on his table. And I said, Adam, this is a bottle of Shiraz that I've made. Let's try it. If you like it, you give me the job. If you don't like it, we'll carry on with the interview. And I got the job as an intern. We didn't open the bottle of wine. We opened that bottle of wine many years later together when he left Klein Constantia. But I got the job as an intern. I eventually became assistant winemaker. And a couple of years later, Klein Constantia was put onto the market, as I mentioned earlier. That was in 2011. It was sold to Staniak and Charles Harmon. Adam then decided to jump ship. He decided to move to Stellenbosch and make wine in Stellenbosch. And now we had two new owners that had taken over this fantastic wine estate. They kind of, for some reason, and I have to thank my lucky stars that all the stars kind of aligned. They said, well, Matt, you've been at Klein Constantia for a very long time. You're young, you're energetic, you kind of know the brand, you know the terroir. We'll give you one chance, and if you prove yourself, you can have the job as head winemaker at Klein Constantia. So that was 2012. I'm still here today. I obviously didn't do too much of a bad job in those days.
It was tough vintage, right? That
It
was
was
difficult to start with. What is in your career there to this day? Was that the most difficult vintage altogether? Um,
So 2012 and 2023 have been the most difficult vintages we've ever had. 2012, the issue is we had a lot of rain in the middle of harvest, so I suppose the same as 2023. So the Vin de Constance, and I'll never forget, it's one of the greatest learning curves in my life. Is very young, very inexperienced. Our MD at the time was Hans Astrom, who's a fantastic guy, a fantastic mentor in my life. I went to him and the Vin de Constance is almost ripe. It wasn't quite there, but it was almost there. And I said, Hans, we've got 2 weeks of rain coming in. I'm too scared. I really want to pick the grapes. And he kind of looked at me and he said, Matt, what are you doing? Are we trying to make the best wine in the world, or are we trying to play it safe? So you make the call, but think about it. You know, are we doing the best wine in the world, or are we playing it safe? So we left it out, and we landed up leaving it for another 3 weeks. The problem was, um, I landed up getting married on the 30th of April, and the grapes pretty much weren't ready. We harvested the last of the Vin de Constance on the 27th of April. I had my bachelor's on the 28th of April and got married on the 30th of April. So it was a crazy season. It's the latest harvest we've ever had, most difficult harvest. We had to press the grapes for a whole week to try and get any juice out of it. It was purely just a mush. And somehow I survived, and I blame that on ignorance because I didn't know any better. I just had to make it work. But I was also very fortunate in those days. No, just did it. Put your head down and have fun and go for it. And now I know a lot better, and I have a few more grey hairs, and I can kind of put it together that that it shouldn't have worked out, but it really did. But I also had two other very big influences in my life at Klein Constantia was the combination of Hubert de Bois, who's the owner of Chateau Angelus, and Bruno Prats, who's an absolute legend. They used to own Costa Estinel, and they I hate to call them this, but they're like the Bordeaux mafia. So they got very involved in Klein Constantia, and they got shares in Klein Constantia, became part owners of Klein Constantia. So as a young winemaker, and I was only 25, 26 years old when I became winemaker at one of the greatest wine properties in the world, I had Bruno Prats and Hubert de Bois that I could pick up the phone and call them and say, listen, guys, I'm struggling with this. Will you do you mind helping me? Or can we do this? Or how can I do this? And I had the greatest mentors. And we had, numerous vintages of their experience that they can put back into Klein Constantia. So I have them to thank for all of that, which is fantastic.
It
We
can
then,
be. Let's move to tasting and let's see uh, how are the wines, what's the significance about the wines and the wine styles that we're going to taste today. And let's start with the brut. So we have the Cap Classic from 2018, and this is 100% Chardonnay. And tell us, when did you start planting Chardonnay? I know there's something in the works with Chardonnay as well, coming in the future. So tell us a bit about the grape, and then we'll move on to the brut itself.
sure. So we've actually had Chardonnay since 1986. We've been making Chardonnay since 1986. Fantastic for Klein Constantia. The Chardonnay for the brut itself is a single vineyard Chardonnay block, very low lying slopes, very sandy soils. The block itself was planted in about 1992, so oldish vineyard Chardonnay. The concept is the reason why we call it brut, and you can see the label now on your presentation. We're calling it Blanc de Blanc. The 2018 is the last of the brut. We called it a brut because we used to have Pinot Noir planted on the farm, and it was a blend between the two in the old days. Pinot works in some vintages and is absolutely terrible in other vintages. So we eventually took down the line that we would just plant Chardonnay and just focus on Chardonnay for it.
So when did you
The
start 100% Chardonnay?
so the first vintage of 100% Chardonnay is about 26. No, it's not 2013, I think. I actually can't remember. That's a very good question. But the first vintage of actually making the bubbles itself was 2000, and that was a Millennium project that they had, and they actually only bottled it in magnums. And I've tasted one of those bottles recently, and it's fantastic. In terms of winemaking, we're making it fully traditional method champenois style, with the twist that we do early harvest, 100% malolactic fermentation. We then barrel age for 9 months, and then we're aiming for at least 36 months on lees in the bottle. So traditional bottle fermented. We still hand riddle and hand disgorge everything. So we do 1,000 bottles at a time. Every day we go down into the cellar, we go and turn all those bottles, and we have fun doing it. The great thing about the Chardonnay is it's a single vintage, it's a very small production. We make this wine as one of our niche wines at Klein Constantia, and it's purely so you can come to the estate and you have a great experience. You can go up to the deck, up at the dam, and come for a great visit, and we can open up a bottle of bubbles, and it's very festive and it's fantastic. We have fun doing it. It's a side product for us, but the problem with doing it as a side product is you kind of don't overcomplicate things, and that's kind of one of my big philosophies as being a winemaker here is don't overcomplicate things; it'll be that much better for it. So we don't overcomplicate it, and it turns out fantastically for the job that it is. So we're never going to be a huge bubbles producer. We're never going to compete with champagne or the big producers in South Africa. But the wine itself often outscores and outshines a lot of the big producers in South Africa as a side product for us. It is festive, it's fun, and everyone has to love bubbles.
So, but let's talk about the style, because you use barrels for the still wines. What do you expect from aging a portion of the wine in a barrel in the final wine?
Look, so we're looking for a little bit of complexity, and I love to have malolactic fermentation in barrel. So it is just bringing out a little bit more of that brioche character to it, bringing out a little bit more complexity. It's not new oaks; it's never going to be oaky, toasty, or get that toffee character from the barrels. It's more about bringing out that extra integrity to the wine. The other way that we bring out a little bit more integrity to it or complexity to it is, and we've changed this. So 2019 is now zero dosage. 2018 is the last vintage of using dosage. Dosage for a lot of winemakers is often their secret weapon. So what we would do is we use very old vintage Chardonnay. So we're blending 1990s, 1992s, 1995s into that, and we'll go the maximum amount of dosage.
The Reserva next vintage, which will be 2019.
Yeah, it'll be zero dosage.
But it will be zero dosage. But the percentage of the older vintages, what's the
Oh,
percentage?
it's tiny, so it's 20 mils and 750 mils. So I actually can't do the maths on that. It's one. No, oh my word, I can't do the maths on that. But anyway, so we found that I don't want to stop talking to work it out. And so we found that those old vintages Chardonnay also just help to bring out a little bit more of that brioche character, that evolution that we're looking for in the bubbles, together with the barrel age, brings out a lovely little bit of complexity to it. This vintage there's a touch of sugar, so there's 6.4 grams of residual sugar on it, which is fairly decent, but it is quite low in the greater scheme of things. And if you look at the pH, it's 3.3.
That's the acidity in the wine.
Yeah, so it keeps it fresh and keeps it accessible, I guess you can call it that. The other thing is very few people in South Africa are doing 100% malolactic fermentation. We have to do it purely because of the climate. We are very cold in Constantia purely because of the ocean. So we pick early in the season. If we didn't do the mallow, we would have an acid of undrinkable levels. It will be very tart. It will be very tight and all the rest. So it's not really worth it. But that again brings up more complexity to the end product. We've also done a lot of experiments into picking out which is the perfect aging on the bottle for the lees. So we've recently released a 10-year on the lees bottle just to experiment with. We've done a 7 years, we've done a 5 years. And with all those experimentations, in terms of going for zero dosage and not having any sugar in it, we found that the amount of lees aging on the bottle is very important because that brings out the richness to it. That means that you don't have to have that sugar to kind of balance out the acidity. So 3 years to 3.5 years is absolutely perfect that you have that great balance between the two.
And this, even though this is 2018, as opposition to the next one that will be zero dosage, this one shows that the lovely, beautiful brioche toast on the nose, but it's also beautifully balanced with the freshness of the fruit, the green apple. The acidity is there. If we were talking the malolactic, that tempers the acidity a little, but the acidity just accentuates the flavor, and it's a fantastic wine. So I encourage all of you to reach out and taste taste it, find it on the market, because this is a unique wine, and if you love bubbles, this is something that you should be tasting and exploring. But let's move on to the next one, which is the Clara Sauvignon
Clara.
Blanc from 2020. And specifically, the Sauvignon Blanc is an important grape variety for you. I know you work a lot and study with the winemakers in Sancerre as well, just to get that perfection when it comes to Sauvignon Blanc, perfection to blending the different parcels, or showing the sense of the place. Tell us about your take on the Sauvignon Blanc production.
Sure. And like the history, I can talk about Sauvignon Blanc for hours, and I won't do that. I'm sorry. Um, in terms of Sauvignon Blanc, there's two schools of thoughts when it comes to Sauvignon Blanc. The one is very New World, and that is where you chase a style, you chase that very aromatic, pungent, kind of tutti frutti style of Sauvignon Blanc. And for me, that is making Sauvignon Blanc by a textbook, and that doesn't have any sense of place to it. And then you have the very old kind of school approach to making Sauv Blanc, and that's kind of where you get your terroir coming in. The fact that it is grown in a place that can't be recreated anywhere else in the world. So when I started off as winemaker at Klein Constantia, I mean, I always used to think that wine is made by a winemaker in a beautiful cellar with all the tools, and the more money you spend on the tools, the better the wine is. I then went out in 2012 to make wine with Pascal Jolivet and Sancerre, and I realized, by being out there, when we went from place to place, we looked at all the soil, we looked at all these vineyards, and it got to a point that, they were saying, Matt, smell the sand, get a feeling for that flint or chalk or whatever it was. Smell it, taste the grapes, go taste the wines in the cellar. And I then realized that wine is actually really made by a sense of place, that fantastic aspect that we talk about of terroir. There's a lot of manipulation that you can do in the cellar, but you can't combat that terroir, and you have to work with that terroir to make a pure wine of your sense of place. So we came back to Klein Constantia. We changed the style completely. We stopped inoculating with yeast, so we're now 100% wild fermentation, 100% hyper-oxidized at crush, so we don't add any sulfur at crush. We try and break down all those unstable, volatile thiols that we're used to with Sauvignon Blanc, and we're trying to create a super complex, stable style of Sauvignon Blanc by doing that. I'm going to go back into terroir. I'm sorry, I jumped into winemaking quickly. In terms of the terroir at Klein Constantia, so we have 42 different blocks of Sauvignon Blanc planted at Klein Constantia. We have a whole lot of different spots and parcels and different areas. The most important aspect for us is we have east-facing slopes, we have south-facing slopes, we have low altitude and we have high altitude. So we start at 70 meters, we go all the way up to 320 meters above sea level. Then we have the ocean on both sides of us. We have 7 kilometers and 5 kilometers from the ocean. That forms our air conditioning. It means that we're cold enough to sustain Sauvignon Blanc in this kind of warm kind of cultivar of South Africa, region of South Africa. So you take all of those aspects, you put them together. So east facing gets a lot of morning sunlight. It's a lot warmer. You get a lot more tropical flavors from it. It's a lot more kind of orange in flavors. South facing is a lot cooler, a lot more austere, a lot more flinty, a lot more spicy, a lot greener in flavor, much higher acidity. Low altitude, again, is very warm. High altitude is very cold. And then one of the things that we never talk about is the soil itself, like they do in Sancerre. So we've got 2 different types of soil, or geology at Klein Constantia, of soil types. The one is decomposed granite. So the granite itself brings out a salinity to the texture on the mid palate. So a saline but umami character to the wines. And then on the higher lying vineyards of Klein Constantia, we have Table Mountain sandstone. Sandstone brings out richness to it. So if we go into Clara itself, Clara is kind of a zoomed in focus on what Klein Constantia is. So I mentioned 42 different blocks. Each and every single vineyard block is made in its own way in the cellar. It gets its own tank. It's vinified in the way that we understand the block to be and the way that we understand its personality. Clara is then 6 different single vineyards on Klein Constantia. very high altitude, so 200 meters to 340 meters above sea level, east and south facing vineyards. Each one of those six single vineyards is vinified in its own way, completely separately. They're all barrel fermented, barrel aged for 9 months. And then it gets to a point that in order to make the best of the best Sauvignon Blanc from these six different single vineyards, we go through each and every single barrel and all of those components, and we select 5 barrels to make a very niche, small production of Sauvignon Blanc from it that represent high altitude, slightly lower altitude, east facing, south facing slopes, as well as that granite and sandstone, and you create a very complex, crazy style of Sauvignon Blanc. So it's also got the wood. So there's quite a bit of new wood in the 2020 Clara Sauvignon Blanc. And it's not that we're adding wood to make it oaky toasty. It's we're adding wood to get that micro-oxygenation happening, so get that evolution of flavors, as well as getting that complexity of the wood to kind of wine ratio. So you put all that together and you can create a very aromatic Sauvignon Blanc that has an incredible sense of place that represents Klein Constantia in a
And that
microscopic way of looking at
line
it.
really showing. So on the nose, you get that buff saline note and the whetstone note, which I personally very much enjoy. Before, and that's followed by the fruit, but that's the first part of the nose, and you get that beautiful complexity of the palate. If you're using French oak, but you're using also in acacia. Why do you use acacia barrels in this case?
Yeah, so acacia's been, we actually stopped using acacia in 2020 was the last vintage. Acacia is quite interesting in that it brings out a lovely spice to the wine. It
Mhm.
is very aromatic and very perfumed. The other benefit of acacia is it doesn't allow any oxygen uptake. So there's no exchange of oxygen through the barrels. There's no micro-oxygenation happening. So it keeps the wine very inert and reductive, and it helps with the final blend to prevent that oxidation happening. I've found that acacia has become too hit and miss in the last couple of years. The wood, I think they grew too quickly in terms of making their barrels, and I don't think they have the wood supply that they did in the old days. We're struggling to get very good acacia barrels these days. There are barrels that you get acacia heads, which is quite nice. That does add a
Okay.
bit of complexity to it. I do like Hungarian oak on top of that as well.
Well, I would like to talk about Hungarian oak once we can get to the Constance, but before we get
Awesome.
there, let's talk about the reds. You have a good climate
Sure.
for reds, but you are making reds, and
Yeah.
the estate is made with Cabernet Sauvignon, Petit Verdot, and Malbec. And I'll start right off the bat there. Why Malbec in that blend?
Malbec is an incredible variety in a cool climate that Constantia is. Um, I d We've always had Malbec in the blend, and Malbec is often very jammy, very tutti fruity, and it never has the structure that you're looking for. In the cool climate of Plain Constantia, we have very small berries. They're very concentrated and they're very expressive. We never want to have a big percentage of Malbec in it. So this vintage is 17% Malbec, which is quite a big whack. The other crazy thing is here we have 19% Petit Verdot, which is unheard of. Often you use Petit Verdot as that salt and pepper on the spot on the top, and you never really go above 5%. A Petit Verdot is really great in the terroir as well. It never becomes too
So
inky,
that's a
too
very
powerful, too
interesting flavor profile.
yeah, it helps massively with. So the other benefit that we have is because we're cool climate, you want to ripen the Cabernet as far as possible. So we often ripen the Cabernet until the point that it's about 15% alcohol. Petit Verdot and Malbec don't have any green tannin to them. So you can pick the Petit and the Malbec very early in the season, and you use the two of them to break the Cabernet back so you can bring it back to a 14.5% alcohol balance, that you have the balance of all of them without having a greener style red blend. The great thing about, so 2018 is one of my favorite vintages of estate red that we have. It is very accessible. It's got a lot of fruit. It's lovely and it's very easy to drink. And it kind of symbolizes what Klein Constantia is. So we're a cool climate. We're never going to be a rock star red wine producing region. We're never going to make a Napa style Bordeaux wine red wine and Klein Constantia. So we've gone out with the focus of making a very easy, elegant, but yet complex red wine from Klein Constantia, and we've made it in that kind of way. So we do 2 pump overs a day. That's it. Very light extraction of the juice during fermentation. We also don't want to extract too much during the fermentation because then you extract too many of the green tannins. So it's very light. We're also using reverse tronconic tanks, which is the opposite to everyone's looking for when they're doing tronconic tanks. Tronconics are for more tannin extraction during the fermentation process. So reverse is just lighter, delicate extraction because of the shape of the tank. And we're doing maximum 12 months in 60% new oak barrels, and that's it. So for my sins, I now make wine in Stellenbosch. I make wine at Wilke. So I've always been a white wine maker. The estate red has always been a great little side project for us. But Wilke is our big red wine project, and that's where we're trying to focus and make that great red wine of Klein Constantia or South Africa. That product, it is made in the perfect region for making great reds.
But this is what I really enjoyed, that drinkability factor in this wine. I really enjoyed that freshness of acidity that's brought into the beautifully ripe fruit. And I think that is a perfect wine that where you can serve that, with food at dinners, and it is ready to be drunk now. But
Yeah,
right now, let's move on
Constance.
to the
Yes.
Constance. So we have a 2011 in front of us for a significant vintage, because a vintage of change. So tell us about the winemaking, the style. What have you changed in the style? Because the changes were progressively were happening when you got on board, and they were happening with when you started blending, right? So when you became a winemaker, you were already blending the wines that were already made, but the style was changing with the ownership as well. What was the changes? What was the reason behind it?
Sure, and great. So 2011, I inherited, although I was assistant winemaker during 2011, and I was very fortunate that I'd actually worked with Adam for a couple of years, and I was able to understand his philosophy and pick up what he was trying to do. So that helped me to inherit the wine and take it to his vision and trying to put a bottle of wine out that he was looking for. So the first blend of Vin Constance that I actually bottled was the 2007. So I'd had a couple of years of experience of blending the 2011 before we got to the 2011. Going back to Adam's story, is Adam took over as winemaker in 2004, and he inherited wines from Ross Gower, and Ross Gower kind of left mid-harvest of 2003. So Adam didn't have anyone to learn from, and he had to recreate or start the wine from fresh, which was a very daunting task. And I was a lot more privileged than what he was when it came to making Vin Constance. I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to be quite quick with this. So 2011 is very important, is that it was the second vintage after becoming very organic in the vineyards. So 2009 we became organic in our approach. The problem was is we went too quick, too fast into becoming organic farming. So 2010 we actually didn't create a Vin Constance, and that's purely because the vines didn't withstand the treatment of being very organic or very basic in terms of the vineyard growing. 2011 was the first vintage that we kind of chiseled back into getting the wines back into balance. In those days, it was made in the old cellar. It was made in terms of winemaking. It was made 2 weeks on the skins, very cold, fermentation in stainless steel tanks, and it was left for 4 years in barrels, which created all the complexity that you're looking for, and it created a very big but almost tertiary style of Vin Constance. You can see it in the glass now. It's very dark. It's very tertiary kind of characteristic. You can see that very copper, kind of bronze kind of color. So the goal for us when we started changing the style, and not changing the style, we just started to look at how we can improve it in very small sectors. So the goal was to take it away from that very tertiary characteristic to bring it more towards secondary characteristics. And with that, it brought out a lot more perfume, a lot more elegance, and made the wine almost sweeter, less sweet, a lot more delicate, and had a better balance. So we changed the cellar, we rebuilt the cellar, we focused a lot more on the bush vines, and I spoke about that a little bit earlier. Also changed the way that we made the wine. So it's now fermented on the skins for 1 week. It left cold in the skins for another week, so 2 weeks still skin contact. We then blend during the fermentation process. So we can take, so during the harvest period, we'll pick 27 different batches. Each and every single batch has its own designated effect in the final blend. So you start with a very high acidity berries in the beginning, and you go to a point that you ask the guys to go out and pick individual raisins. We also then go out and they pick, percentage of raisins for the bunch. So it's 30%, 40%, 60% bunches with raisins. Each and every single one of those components is made in its own way. And I spoke about vinification process. So we'll start with 27 different batches. We then blend each and every single batch during the fermentation process to give you that perfect balance that we're looking for between sugar, alcohol, and acidity. So if you get that right, and during the blending process, we can get that combination right. Fermentation stops by itself. You also get the balance between sugar and acidity that makes the wine taste a lot drier in style. So we're trying to create a sweet wine that almost doesn't taste sweet. The sugar is there to enhance the flavor, but it doesn't taste sucrose or sweet or cloy or anything like that. And I think that's the trick to Vin Constance that we've had in the last couple of years. It is dry, it's easy to drink and go with any part of the meal as opposed to being a dessert wine. So we blend during the fermentation, and then we've perfected the aging of the Vin Constance. So we're now doing 1.5 years in 500-liter barrels, and that's when your evolution starts from primary flavors to secondary flavors. And once it gets to secondary flavors because of the oxygenation, we then put it into 4,500-liter foudre for another year and a half. So it gets to secondary, you put into the foudre itself. It's a big wooden vat. That's kind of like a time capsule. You're still getting integration of oak without getting the integration of oxygen. So it stops the evolution of flavors and keeps it from going to that tertiary characteristic. So you put all that together, you're creating that great sweet wine that we're talking about. It's not over the top. It's got the two aspects of balance between sugar and acidity, and it's not too tertiary in flavors. And that's where we're at in current day Vin Constance. I've got the 2020 here. I don't want to kill my plants, but I want to throw my glass up. It's much lighter, much more delicate in terms of the way that it is. It's a lot more perfumed. It's a lot more aromatic. And that's kind of where we're getting to is we're striving for that delicacy. We're striving for that perfect balance. We're striving for a sweet wine, as I said, that doesn't taste sweet. A
Can
lot
you
of
talk about
information.
variety itself?
Yeah, so it's Muscat Le Petit Grand or Muscat de Frontignan.
Mhm.
The great thing about, so Muscat works for us in that it raisins very easily. It doesn't form botrytis. We don't want to be a botrytized wine. We don't want to be a noble at harvest because then we start competing with the other great sweet wines of the world. Vin Constance is unique. It is unique in that it's made from raisins. It's unique in flavor. There's no other wine made like this. So Muscat de France gives us that point of difference that it can achieve that goal.
But you also mentioned the Hungarian oak before. That you love Hungarian oak, and you're using Hungarian oak making them the Constance as well. What does the Hungarian oak bring in? Because there is a lot to learn from Hungarian as well. Completely different style of wine, but why Hungarian oak?
So I'm very passionate about it. I was fortunate enough to work in Tokaj in Hungary in 2010. Uh, and I was 2011. Sorry, I worked for Het Solo, and I was able to get out into the forest and experience, the forest and see what it's all about. And I then went out to the cooperage in Budapest, and I got to see all of that. So I love French oak. It works really well. It's quite expensive, and you never know where it's coming from. Whereas Hungarian oak brings out exactly the same complexity that you get from French oak. Much better price point. It's and it brings out a lot of complexity to the wine as well.
Okay,
We're only
so
using about 10% Hungarian oak in the blend though at the end.
fantastic. This is one of the most amazing sweet wines of the world. The iconic wine. The 2011 we had 152 grams of the residual sugar, and I there is that mustard nose to it. There's that floral note to it. But with that, in 11, as you mentioned, we have those notes coming from the toffee caramel, which are absolutely exquisite in this bottle at the moment. There's the sweetness, but that's because of the climatic conditions and the acidity. There's a gorgeous balance on the palate as well. So this is something I personally have been always looking into. I've tasted recently 2004 as well. I'm really looking forward to tasting 2020 to see the changes and see how the style is developing. But in our classroom and during our classes, we always cherish the moment we can open a bottle of Vin de Constant and actually share that history of the estate and the production there in with our students. So, uh, just because we're running into the final 5 minutes, let's talk about a few things that are coming up. Let's talk about some of the new releases. Let's talk about the new plans for the Chardonnay. And I'm going to mention here, because if you're fascinated with the Klein Constantia as we are, and South African wines all together, we are taking our students on February 28th to South Africa, and we will be visiting the property. So, what's new? What's coming up? What do we not know yet?
I mentioned it earlier, it's the most exciting thing for us at Klein Constantia is our red wine project. So as I said, I'm now heading up as winemaker in Stellenbosch, and we're going all out in Stellenbosch. We've got a tiny little Bordeaux style kind of cellar that we're making it out of. We've got our own vineyards there. Hopefully, we're going to go organic and more sustainable in that property. We're also going very organic and biodynamic at Klein Constantia, which is very important. You know, we're farming for the future, which is great. I mean, we're custodians to this great brand, but we're looking towards the next 300 years as opposed to the last 300 years. So, in Wilk is a fantastic project. So look out for it wherever you can find it. It'll be hopefully in the next couple of years, if I do my job properly, it's going to be one of those iconic red wines from Stellenbosch. So that's where my passion lies at the moment. And
Well,
the other goal is just
saying that in the future, but from my understanding of the market today, it's pretty significant already.
it's doing very well. I just haven't been behind the helms until now, so I'm going out with a bang. I'm trying to get that 100 pointer and push it up as much as we can. I mean, that's the brainchild of Hubert de Bois and Bruno Prats. They've done a fantastic job with the property. They've just kind of redefined what Stellenbosch actually is and what the style of Stellenbosch and Heidelberg actually is. So it's very exciting to be involved in that great product. My other goal is Sauvignon Blanc, Sauvignon Blanc, Sauvignon Blanc, Sauvignon Blanc, and more Sauvignon Blanc. Look out for the Klein Constantia Sauvignon Blancs. I think that New Zealand has done a great job in the New World, but there is a great job for the New World producers of the world to come out and put our stamp on creating a different style of Sauvignon Blanc, and that's exactly what we're trying to do at Klein Constantia. So we'll get it out, and I'm sure you can get a lot of it in the States or wherever you are in the world. It is that wine that you can look out for, and it's not hell of an expensive wine to get. It's a very good price and fantastic value for what you're getting.
I have to say that wine, for me, it's absolutely amazing when it comes to quality. That's my personal discovery as well, and I will be definitely talking about that more because it shows the huge potential of what can come from South Africa when it comes to Sauvignon Blanc. So with that, we're at our time. I would like to thank you, Matt, and thanks for Academie du Vin for bringing to our attention the Klein Constantia Vin de Constant book. If you want to learn more, please reach out because it's full of the gorgeous history, but also it's up to today. So you will actually see Matt there. on the pages talking about the changes and the wines that he's been making and his significance on the wine style. So, Matthew, thank you for providing us with such a beautiful insight to the winemaking and history of Constantia. And we're looking forward to one day to having you here. If you're ever flying to Napa, please come and join us. Our students would love to see you here at the Academy. And for the audience, we're hoping that you will explore and enjoy the wines and see the new wave and new changes of South African wines that are coming to the US market. So thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you for having me.